In 1332, an English king sent a royal judge north to hunt down a gang of brothers. The gang kidnapped the judge. They held him for 1,300 marks and he paid it the next day. Then the crown pardoned them and gave them jobs. Today, 10 medieval bandits so feared that kings sent entire armies after them. Which one destroyed a royal army in the field? Let's go. Number 10. The Stolen Judge. In the high country of Derbyshire, where the moorland runs out of trees and the wind never really stops, there is a web of old roads that in the 1300s no careful traveler used alone. The land up there is beautiful and empty. It is also, from the point of view of a man who robs people for a living, close to perfect. Every valley is a funnel. Every ridge is a watchtower. And for 5 years, the men who owned those roads were not the King of England and not his sheriff. They were 3 brothers from a perfectly respectable family. James, Nicholas, and John Cottrell were not starving peasants driven into crime. They were minor gentry, the class that made English local government work. Men of exactly their rank served on juries, hunted down thieves, held the king's peace in their own corner of the shire, and answered to the crown when it broke. The Cottrells had all of that authority. They simply pointed it in the other direction and built a business out of it. The first entry in the record is small and ugly. In 1328, the brothers and their men raided the church at Bakewell and took 10 shillings out of the offerings and beat the vicar while they were at it. 10 shillings is not a fortune even by the standards of a village. What matters is what nobody did about it. No arrest, no punishment, no consequence at all. Somewhere between that raid and the following winter, the brothers worked out the single most valuable fact of their careers, which is that the machinery meant to stop them was slow, local, and easy to buy. What they built next was not banditry in the storybook sense. It was a protection racket with a price list, and the prices survive because they ended up in court records. Late in 1331, a man named Ralph Murimuth paid them 100 shillings. Robert Francis of Hardstoft paid 40 shillings. The mayor of Nottingham, William Amyas, was billed £20. And a knight named Geoffrey Luttrell, remembered today mostly because his name is attached to one of the most beautiful illuminated books England ever produced, paid £40. Think about what that list actually is. That is a mayor, a knight, and a row of respectable landowners quietly buying peace from a gang, the way a shopkeeper buys it now. The armed wing that collected the money even had a name for itself, a French phrase that meant the savage company. It is worth asking why nobody stopped this, and the answer is that England at that moment was barely being governed at all. The reign of Edward II had ended in disaster and deposition. His son came to the throne as a teenager under the control of others, and had to seize his own government by force. The crown's attention and money were pointed north at Scotland and soon west across the sea at France. In the middle of all that, law enforcement in a place like the Peak was not a police force. It was a handful of local gentlemen with the authority to raise their neighbors, and those same local gentlemen were the people paying the Cottrells. The system was not broken from outside. It had quietly changed owners. Then came the 14th of January, 1332, and the thing that puts the Cottrells in this list. The Crown had finally noticed. It sent a royal justice into the Midlands specifically to break up the gangs of the Peak, a senior judge named Richard de Willoughby. He was not a local official who could be threatened over a fence. He was the king's own hand, arriving with the king's own authority to hang them. So they kidnapped him. Somewhere between 20 and 30 armed men, the Cottrells working in league with the Folville gang, took a sitting royal judge off the road and held him. The ransom was 1,300 marks, and here is the detail that says everything about what the law was worth in England that winter. Willoughby paid. By the Chronicle account, he paid the next day, in full, without argument. The judge who had been sent to put a price on their heads ended up putting a price on his own, and settling the bill before breakfast. There is one more layer to it that makes the whole episode even harder to read as a simple fight between order and crime. Richard de Willoughby was not a spotless hero of the law. Years later, when Edward III finally turned his attention to the corruption of his own judiciary, Willoughby himself was among the justices accused of selling the king's justice for money. So the picture is not a clean one of a righteous judge falling into the hands of thieves. It is a senior officer of a bought court being kidnapped by a gang of gentlemen bandits and buying his own freedom overnight, in a countryside where everybody with any power was quietly trading in the same commodity. For a moment it looked as though the crown would finally answer. Edward III sent a special judicial commission north with real teeth. Men were named, indicted, hunted, and then the whole thing dissolved the way water dissolves into sand. The principal culprits were never hanged. They were never broken on any wheel. After 1333 the record fills up instead with royal pardons, and then with something far stranger than pardons. The men who had robbed a church, taxed a mayor, and abducted a royal judge turn up holding positions in the service of the crown, and one of them ends his life as a bailiff in the Queen's own service in the Peak, protected by the same system he had spent 5 years farming. That is the first thing worth understanding about medieval banditry, and it will come back again and again in this list. The crown did not lose to the culprits because it lacked soldiers. It lost because the gang and the government were made out of the same men, and once that is true, an army is not a solution. It is a negotiating position. Still on paper, the culprits remained living people with names and rights. The next man on this list had that taken away from him by law, and it barely slowed him down. Number 9. The legally dead robber. Picture a wagon train crawling along a road in Franconia, in southern Germany in the middle of the 1300s, heavy with cloth and spice and silver, heading for one of the richest trading cities in the empire. Now picture the wooded rise above that road, and a mounted man sitting on it, watching, unhurried, wearing armor he inherited rather than bought. That is the whole business model of a robber knight, and its most famous practitioner in German memory was a man the songs call Eppelein. His real name was Eppelein von Gailingen. He was born into the lower nobility around 1320, at exactly the moment when that class was going quietly broke. The old military value of a small armored landowner was collapsing, and the new money was in trade, and trade was flowing into cities like Nuremberg that owed such men nothing. A knight in that position had 3 options: sell up, serve someone richer, or ride down to the road and take a cut by force. Eppelein and a great many like him chose the road. The Germans have a specific word for the type, robber knight, and for a century those men effectively privatized the highways of the empire. To see why that worked so well, look at what a medieval trade convoy actually was. Goods moved overland at walking pace, in heavy carts, on roads that were often little more than rutted tracks through woodland, with the whole value of a merchant house strapped down under canvas. A convoy could not run, could not hide, and could not easily fight. It could only pay guards, and guards cost money, and the more guards you hire, the less profit the trip earns. Every merchant on the roads of Franconia was doing that arithmetic constantly, and a man on a hill with a dozen riders was the reason it never came out well. Nuremberg was the natural target and also the natural enemy. Every wagon Eppelein stopped was Nuremberg's profit, and by the 1360s the city was done tolerating it. In 1369, a court there placed him under the imperial ban. That phrase deserves unpacking, because it is one of the most quietly brutal instruments in medieval law. A man under the imperial ban was, in legal terms, treated as though he were already dead. He had no rights. He could hold no property. No court would hear him. No contract bound anyone to him. No one owed him protection. And crucially, anyone at all could kill him in the street and walk away without penalty. It was not a prison sentence. It was the removal of a human being from the category of people the law is willing to notice. The logic of it was that no state in the empire had a standing police force capable of finding one mounted man in the forests of Franconia. So instead of hunting him, the law made him free game and outsourced the hunt to everyone. It was a bounty without a treasury behind it, and it worked often enough that most men under the ban either fled the region or went quiet. Eppelein went on robbing for another 12 years. That is the detail that made him a folk hero, and it is not legend. It is chronology. One of the most powerful commercial cities in the empire formally erased a man from existence, and the erased man kept taking its wagons for over a decade. In 1372 they got close. He was seized at Forchheim after somebody sold him out, and his stronghold was broken. He still came back to the roads. The end, when it came, was squalid rather than heroic. In 1381 he was taken at Postbauer, not in a battle and not in a forest, but at a drinking party, sitting down with his men. On the 15th of May, 1381, at Neumarkt, he was broken on the wheel, which meant his limbs were shattered and his body displayed until it stopped moving. The city had finally killed a man it had already declared dead 12 years earlier. And then Nuremberg did something no one planned. It kept him. The story everybody tells is that Eppelein was once cornered inside the walls of Nuremberg Castle itself, and escaped by putting his horse straight over the moat, an impossible jump, leaving hoofprints gouged into the stone. Visitors are shown those marks today. The head of the Nuremberg City Archive, Michael Diefenbacher, has stated plainly that no document supports any of it, and that the legend takes shape in folk songs generations after the man was dead. That is the second layer here, and it is the more disturbing one. The city spent real money and real years hunting him, executed him in public, and then carved his myth into its own wall and sold it. Hate a man long enough and thoroughly enough and you end up curating him. 12 years and a betrayal at a drinking table was what one city needed to bring down a single night. In England, a generation earlier, the crown had faced a man in the woods who could not be reached that cheaply. To get at him, they had to lay siege to a castle. Number 8. The Sherwood Outlaw. Sherwood in the 1260s was not the tidy woodland of the ballads. It was royal forest, which was a legal category before it was a landscape, and it meant that everything living in it belonged to the king. Killing a deer there could cost a man a crippling fine, or a year and a day in the king's prison. Cutting timber could ruin a family. Into that forest, in the autumn of 1267, walked a defeated soldier with nothing left to lose, and for the next 5 years, the crown of England could not get him out. His name was Roger Godberd, and he did not begin as a criminal. He began on the losing side of a civil war. For 2 years England had been torn open by the baronial revolt against Henry III, led by Simon de Montfort, a man who had briefly done something genuinely revolutionary and summoned a parliament that included ordinary townsmen. On the 4th of August, 1265, that experiment was destroyed at Evesham. It was not really a battle. It was an execution carried out at the scale of an army. Montfort was killed and his body cut apart on the field, and the men who had followed him discovered afterward that they had lost more than a war. Under the terms imposed by the victors, they lost their lands as well, and could buy them back only at 5 times what the land earned in a year. Contemporaries had a word for them: the disinherited. That single administrative decision manufactured an outlaw problem out of thin air. Take a few thousand trained fighting men, strip them of property, home, and legal standing on the same afternoon, and you have not restored order. You have recruited an army for whoever will feed it. Godberd, a Leicestershire man with military experience and no future, went into the trees and started feeding it himself. By later accounts, his band ran to about 100 men, and they were not amateurs. They were veterans, deserters and dispossessed landholders who knew formations, knew roads, knew how convoys move and where they slow down. They robbed travelers and religious houses across Nottinghamshire and Leicestershire, and the reason the Crown could not simply flush them out of the woods is the reason bandits everywhere survive longer than they should. They were not living in the woods full time. They were being sheltered by people with roofs. The most remarkable of those people was a knight named Richard Folliot, a landowner of standing, with a fortified house at Fenwick that the king's clerks called a castle. He hid Godberd, not out of romance and probably not out of politics, but because in a countryside where royal power was thin, an armed band was a resource, and the man who could call on it had leverage over his neighbors. Which is how, in 1270, England arrived at the scene that puts this story in this list. Royal forces moved on Fenwick and laid siege to it, not to punish a rebel lord, not to take a strategic fortress in a war. A siege, with the manpower and cost that implies, mounted to extract one robber from the woods. Folliot gave way, surrendered the castle and handed over his own son as a hostage for his good behavior, and Godberd got out anyway. They finally took him in 1272 on land belonging to Rufford Abbey. Then the story turns almost comic. He was put in Nottingham Castle, one of the strongest fortresses in the Midlands, and he escaped from it. They caught him again. After that, the Crown stopped trusting any single set of walls and started moving him, Nottingham, then Bridgnorth, then Chester, roughly 3 years of transfers before he was eventually brought south to the Tower of London to face trial. Read that as an administrator would read it. The government of England did not believe it could hold this man in one place. And then, having spent 5 years in the woods, a castle siege, 3 prisons and a state trial on him, the Crown let him go. Godberd was pardoned after Edward I came home from crusade, and he went back to his land a free man. There is one more thing about him that historians argue over, and it is worth stating carefully, because it is the sort of claim this channel does not make lightly. In roughly 1447, the Scottish chronicler Walter Bower wrote about Robin Hood and placed him in exactly this moment, as a man who became an outlaw after Evesham. Godberd was a real outlaw of Sherwood, hunted by a real sheriff of Nottingham, sheltered by a real knight. In the exact years Bower describes, that does not prove anything. Historians treat him as a possible ingredient in the legend rather than the man himself, but it does mean something simpler and stranger. The ballad that England has told itself for 600 years, about a good outlaw in Sherwood and the sheriff who could not catch him, is not entirely invented. Underneath it there are court records, and in those records the sheriff really did fail for 5 years, at enormous public expense. England hunted its outlaws through forests because in England the roads were the crowns and the trees were where you hid. In Italy the geography was different and so was the arrogance. One Italian bandit did not hide at all. He took a fortress, put it directly over the most traveled road in Christendom and charged. Number 7. The Pope's Bandit. Between Siena and Rome the ground rises into a long volcanic ridge, and on the top of it sits Radicofani, a fortress with a view that in the late 1200s was worth more than gold. Below it ran the Via Francigena, the Pilgrim Road, the single artery down which northern Europe walked, rode and hauled its way to Rome. Merchants used it. Bishops used it. Kings on their way to be blessed used it. Everything and everyone that mattered in medieval Christendom eventually passed under that hill. A man named Ghino di Tacco took the fortress and began charging tolls to the entire Western Church. He did not start as a bandit. He started as a son. His father, Tacco di Ugolino, was a nobleman on the wrong side of Siena's endless factional politics, and he was executed in public, on the great shell-shaped square in the middle of the city, in front of everyone who mattered. That square is now one of the most photographed places in Italy. For Ghino, it was the place where the state killed his father and expected the family to accept it. He went outside the law instead, gathered men, and seized Radicofani in the borderland where the territory of Siena met the lands of the Pope. In that convenient gap where each authority could tell itself, the problem belonged to the other one. What made him famous was not violence, it was manners. By every account that survives, Ghino robbed with a strange and deliberate courtesy. He did not simply strip travelers. He took a share, he was polite about it, and he always left the victim enough money to complete the journey. That sounds sentimental until you look at it as a business decision, and then it becomes cold and rather brilliant. A traveler robbed to the skin turns back, complains to a lord, and eventually somebody raises troops. A traveler who is relieved of a portion, treated with respect, and sent on with his horse, and his dinner money arrives in Rome with a story rather than a grievance. Ghino was not being kind. He was managing the only thing that could destroy him, which was the willingness of powerful people to spend money killing him. Then he took the wrong passenger, and it turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to him. The abbot of Cluny was one of the richest churchmen in Europe, master of a monastic network that stretched across the continent, and he was traveling to take the waters for a bad stomach. Ghino's men lifted him off the road entire. What happened next is told in the Decameron, written some 60 years later. It is a tale, not a record, so take it as the story rather than the document. In the tale, Ghino held the great abbot and fed him nothing but dry bread and thin wine, day after day, the diet of a poor man. The abbot's stomach complaint got better. The bandit then released him, with courtesy and with gifts, having cured for free the ailment that the richest physicians of Europe had failed to touch. The ending is harder to believe than the fable. The abbot went to Rome and used his considerable influence on behalf of the man who had just robbed him. Ghino di Tacco received a pardon from Pope Boniface VIII, and with it an appointment as a prior of the hospital, an office with income, standing, and the protection of the church. No surviving document records that pardon. It comes down to us inside the same tale, which historians treat as literature rather than archive. Read that again slowly. That is the ending medieval Italy found perfectly believable. The church could not clear bandits from its own pilgrim road, so it put the head bandit on the payroll and gave him a title. People believed it because they had watched it happen to other men. It looks absurd until you look at the map the way a 14th century official had to look at it. Radicofani sat almost exactly where the territory of Siena ended and the lands of the Pope began. To dig him out, somebody had to raise troops, march them up a volcanic ridge, and besiege a fortress built on rock, at their own expense, in order to protect travelers who mostly came from somewhere else entirely and paid taxes to somebody else entirely. Every authority that could have done it had a perfectly good reason to believe the job belonged to the neighbors. Hiring him, by contrast, cost one appointment. Medieval government was often less a question of right and wrong than a question of who could be billed, and Ghino built his whole career in the gap between two treasuries. We know he was not a minor local nuisance, because of who mentions him. Dante names Ghino di Tacco in the 6th canto of the Purgatory, dropping the name without explanation, the way a writer today would refer to a criminal everyone has seen on the news. That is the surest measure of fame there is. You do not need to introduce a man whose name is already furniture. Ghino robbed his way into a churchman's office. The next man robbed his way into a castle, and the king who tried to stop him did not send a commission or a sheriff. He sent 100 knights. Number 6, the 100-Knight Hunt. On the border between England and Wales, in a flat green field in Shropshire, there is a ruin sitting in a lake of its own reflection. Whittington Castle today is a picturesque gatehouse and a moat full of ducks. 800 years ago it was the reason a nobleman burned 3 years of his life robbing his own king, and the reason that king sent 100 armored knights into the woods after a single man. The man was Fulk FitzWarin, and the fight was about a piece of paper. His family had a claim to Whittington that went back generations, the kind of claim that in England was pursued through law rather than war, slowly, expensively, with charters and lawyers and gifts to the right people. When King John came to the throne, Fulk did what a loyal magnate was supposed to do. He offered money for a formal grant of the castle. He offered £100, which was a serious sum, the price of an estate. John gave the castle to somebody else. He gave it to a rival, Maurice of Powys, for 50 marks. A mark was 2/3 of a pound, so the rival paid roughly £33. The King of England took the smaller offer. That is the detail worth sitting with, because it explains the entire episode better than any tale of tyranny. Fulk did not lose Whittington by being poor, or weak, or on the wrong side of a war. He lost it by bidding too much for something the king had already decided to hand to a friend. He had played the legal game exactly as the system told him to play it, and he watched the system take his money and hand his inheritance to someone who mattered more that week. He renounced his homage, walked away from court, and was declared an outlaw. What followed was 3 years of extremely professional crime. Fulk had 3 brothers, William, Philip, and John, and something like 50 followers, and they went into the wooded border country of Shropshire and the Welsh March and made the king's business unworkable there. They took royal convoys. They ambushed supply trains. They used the frontier the way frontiers have always been used, slipping over into Wales when English pursuit got serious and back again when it did not. They were not living on scraps. They were conducting a campaign of economic pressure on a specific target, which was the Crown's ability to look competent in the West. In the spring of 1201, John responded with force. He sent Hubert de Burgh, one of the most capable royal servants of the age, a man who would later be Justiciar of England and hold the whole kingdom's administration in his hands, and he sent him with 100 knights. Set that against what a knight actually was. Not a soldier. A knight was a mounted armored professional supported by land, servants and horses that cost more than most villages, the medieval equivalent of a piece of heavy military hardware with a crew. 100 of them was a serious field force, enough to fight a small battle, enough to break a rebellion. King John committed that force against roughly 50 outlaws in wet border woodland and got nothing. The ending is the part that would be unbelievable in fiction. On the 11th of November, 1203, Fulk FitzWarin and more than 30 of his men were pardoned. In 1204, he paid a fine of 200 marks, and the Crown handed him Whittington Castle, legally, permanently, in his own name. Add up that arithmetic. He offered £100 for the castle and was refused. He then spent 3 years robbing the king, was hunted by 100 knights, and finally acquired the castle for 200 marks, which is around £133. For an extra £30 in a war, he got exactly what he had asked to buy in the first place. The lesson the English aristocracy took from that was not subtle, and John's reign would eventually run aground in a field at Runnymede, with barons pointing at a document. There is a legend attached to Fulk that needs to be handled honestly, because it is the most repeated thing about him and it is not true. Late in the 13th century, somebody wrote a romance about his life, one of the first biographical adventure stories in European literature, and in it, the young Fulk and the young Prince John quarrel over a game of chess, and Fulk strikes the prince with the chessboard. It is a wonderful scene, and it is fiction. The 2 men did not have a personal duel. During the years of the hunt, John was largely across the sea in Normandy losing a different war, and the pursuit was run by his officials. What was real was much less romantic and much more modern. A rich man was cheated in a transaction. The courts offered him nothing, and he discovered that violence was the only appeal available. Fulk wanted one castle, and he took the whole royal administration of a county hostage to get it. The next man on this list did not bother with a castle. He took a city. Number 5. The King of Bristol. In 1347, Bristol was the third largest city in England and the realm's second port after London, a forest of masts and cranes at the meeting of two rivers, thick with wine from Gascony, wool going out, ships loading for Ireland and Spain. It was the beating financial heart of the west of England, and for a period in that year, it belonged to a criminal who called himself a king. The records name him Adam the Leper. What the name meant, whether he actually carried the disease or whether it was simply the ugliest label available for a man everyone wanted branded untouchable, the sources do not settle. What they do record is what he did, and it is close to unbelievable for the reign of Edward III, a king remembered for order, chivalry, and the opening victories of the Great War with France. Adam's gang effectively took the port. Not raided it, took it. They seized ships at anchor and confiscated cargoes as though they held an office. He had himself proclaimed king of the robbers and issued proclamations in a real city with a real mayor and real royal officials somewhere inside it, while simultaneously robbing that city blind. There is a specific kind of nerve in that. Most bandits want to be invisible. This one wanted a title, a court, and a public voice, and he took the trouble to perform authority in the middle of the crime. Among the vessels he seized were ships sailing on the business of Edward III himself. That was the moment a local criminal problem became a matter of the crown's dignity. Then came London. The gang went after a merchant in the capital who was holding royal property, the jewels of Queen Philippa of Hainault, the king's wife, and they came at night. When the man refused to hand it over, they did not negotiate and they did not withdraw. They set his house on fire, and they carried the treasure out of the flames while it burned. Historians looking at the scale of the losses reach for the only comparison available, which is the great robbery of 1303, when Richard of Pudlicot got inside the royal treasury of Edward I and stripped it. Nothing since that raid had cost the crown so much property to a simple criminal seizure. There is also a question hanging over the whole episode that the records never answer, and it is the most interesting thing about it. A gang does not seize the shipping of the third city in England without local men looking the other way. Somebody had to know which ships carried what. Somebody had to be willing to buy stolen cargo in quantity, quietly, and move it on. Bristol was a port full of merchants who competed viciously with each other and resented the crown's demands for money and ships for the French war. Whether Adam the Leper was a pure predator on that city, or partly its instrument, is not something the surviving documents will tell us. What they do tell us is that, for a while, in one of the wealthiest ports in Europe, the crown's writ meant less than the word of a man with no title at all. Edward III sent a proper force after him, under Lord Thomas Berkeley, a substantial baron of the West Country with the men and the standing to finish the job. And it worked. Adam was taken, and in 1348 he was brought to Winchester to be tried. That is where the story stops behaving like a story about justice. While the trial went forward, Adam's gang came to Winchester and surrounded the building. They did not attempt a rescue, which would have been a straightforward crime the state knew how to punish. They simply stood outside the courthouse and beat the people who came out of it. Every clerk, every witness, every juror who walked through those doors had to walk out through a corridor of men who had watched him do it and knew exactly where he lived. The case was quietly dropped. Adam the Leper was released, and the crown never got him back. That is the second layer, and it is worse than the theft. A medieval court did not usually fail because it lacked evidence. It failed here because it was frightened, and because the crown had discovered the practical limit of its own reach. On paper, Edward III was the most formidable monarch in Europe that decade, winning battles in France that are still in every textbook. In a courtroom in his own kingdom, his justice looked out of the window at a crowd of thugs and let a man walk who had robbed the queen. Adam took jewels, ships, and cargo, and the crown swallowed it because in the end those things can be replaced. The next man reached for the one thing no treasury can replace. He came for the children. Number 4. The Stolen Princes. On the night of the 7th of July, 1455, the castle at Altenburg in Saxony was quiet in the way that only a very safe building is quiet. It was a princely residence, not a frontier fort. The elector was away. The household was asleep. Somewhere inside were 2 boys, aged 14 and 11, who between them carried the entire future of one of the great dynasties of Europe. By dawn they were gone, and the man who took them was not a foreign enemy or a professional criminal. He was a knight who had fought for their father, and he believed he was collecting a debt. Kunz von Kauffungen had spent his adult life in the wars of central Germany. He had fought in the long, grinding aftermath of the Hussite conflict, and then in the war between the Saxon brothers that ran from 1446 to 1451, a civil war between 2 Wettin princes that wrecked the countryside and settled almost nothing. Kunz fought on the side of Frederick II, called the Gentle, and by the standards of his class, he had done everything right. He had served, he had lost property in the service, and he expected the settlement that always followed such wars: land, compensation, restored estates, the payment that made a knight's whole economic existence possible. He did not get it. The claim ground through arbitration and court and princely favor and came out the other end as nothing. The elector he had bled for decided against him, so he decided to take a hostage worth more than the debt. The plan was executed with real competence. Kunz and his accomplices used ladders and inside knowledge, moved through the castle, and lifted the 2 princes out of it. The older boy was Ernst, 14 years old. The younger was Albert, 11. Understand who those children were, because it is what turns a kidnapping into a matter of state. Ernst and Albert would go on to found the Ernestine and Albertine lines of the House of Wettin. Every ruler of Saxony for the next 4.5 centuries would descend from one of those 2 boys, and so would a long row of European royal houses. Kunz did not steal 2 hostages. He stole an entire dynasty in one room in a single night over an unpaid bill. And in his own mind, he was almost certainly not committing a monstrous crime. Taking hostages for an unpaid debt was close to normal practice among the fighting nobility of central Germany. A knight who could not get satisfaction from a prince seized the prince's property, his merchants, his cattle, or his people, held them and forced a settlement. It had a name, it had customs, and men did it to each other constantly. Kunz simply took that ordinary, semi-legal mechanism of feud and applied it to the 2 most valuable people in Saxony, and in doing so stepped over a line he seems genuinely not to have seen. That is the thing about lines drawn by power. They are invisible until you are on the wrong side of one. Then the plan collided with a working man in a wood. The kidnappers split up to cross the border into Bohemia. The party holding the younger boy, Albert, moved through forest near the frontier and stopped, and they had the bad luck to be seen by a charcoal burner named Georg Schmidt. Charcoal burning was one of the lowest and dirtiest occupations in medieval Germany, a life spent alone in the woods tending smoldering mounds of wood, blackened, poor, invisible to everyone. The man had no armor, no rank, and no reason on earth to intervene in a matter involving armed nobles. He intervened anyway. By the account preserved in Saxony, this one laborer confronted the escort, held them, and got the boy free, and other men came running. The 11-year-old prince was taken from a party of armed knights by a man carrying the tools of a charcoal pit. The reward tells you how much that mattered to the House of Wettin. Schmidt was given the right to burn charcoal free of charge, an estate near Zwickau, and minor noble status. He walked into that forest as one of the poorest men in Saxony and walked out of it as a landowner with a coat of arms. And to this day, the town of Altenburg tells that story with real affection. The rest went quickly. Ernst, the older boy, was released after 3 days, traded not for money but for pardons for the accomplices. Kunz von Kauffungen was captured, and on the 14th of July, 1455, he was publicly beheaded on the Upper Market Square in Freiburg. From the night of the kidnapping to the fall of the blade was 7 days. Compare that to everything you have heard so far in this list. England spent 5 years and a castle siege on Roger Godberd and then pardoned him. Nuremberg spent 12 years on Eppelein. A royal judge was abducted in Derbyshire, and the guilty men were absorbed into royal service. Kunz von Kauffungen touched 2 children, and the machinery of the state, so slow and so corruptible in every other case, came down on him inside a week, without a single procedural hesitation. That is the honest lesson of this one, and it is not a comfortable one. Medieval justice was not weak, it was selective. It moved at exactly the speed of the interests of the men who owned it. Rob a merchant, tax a mayor, burn a monastery's granary, and the wheels turn slowly enough that you may well die of old age. Touch the bloodline, and there is suddenly no shortage of soldiers, no procedural delay, and no appetite for pardon at all. Kunz reached for a dynasty with a ladder and a night's work, and lost his head in a week. Half a world away, 5 centuries earlier, another man in the service of a government looked at the criminals he had been sent to destroy and made a very different calculation. He decided he would rather be one of them. Number 3. The Pirate Hunter King. The inland sea of Japan is a long sheltered corridor of water threaded with hundreds of islands, and in the 10th century it was the country's main artery. Tax rice, silk, timber, tribute, official correspondence, everything the imperial court in Kyoto lived on came up that water. Hundreds of islands, narrow straits, ferocious tidal currents, countless hidden anchorages. It is, geographically, the most inviting place to be a pirate in the entire Japanese archipelago, and by the 930s piracy, there had grown from a nuisance into a structural threat. So the court did what governments do. It appointed a man to fix it. In 936, a minor aristocrat named Fujiwara no Sumitomo was sent to the inland sea to suppress the pirates. He was good at it. He knew the waters, he understood the communities the raiders came from, and he broke the pirate operations. On paper it was a successful government campaign, exactly the sort of unglamorous provincial work that career officials did in the hope of promotion. Sumitomo's hope was concrete. By the chronicles that tell his story, he expected to be made governor of the province of Iyo. He did not get the post. Now consider what that man was sitting on at that exact moment. He had spent years learning the geography of every hidden inlet in the inland sea. He personally knew the surviving pirate captains, their crews and their networks, because he had spent his career hunting them. He knew precisely how the government's coastal defenses worked, where they were thin, and how slowly the capital reacted. He had been handed, at public expense, the most complete criminal education available in 10th century Japan. And then he had been told his loyal service had earned him nothing. He went back to the men he had defeated, and he took command of them. What he built was not a gang. It was a state. Sumitomo gathered the surviving pirates, recruited discontented peasants and out-of-favor warriors, and established a base on the island of Hibari. Chronicles put his fleet at more than 1,000 vessels. Even allowing for the enthusiasm of medieval scribes, the scale of what followed is not in doubt, because we can measure it by what he attacked. He hit the government arsenals of Awaji and armed his men from the state's own stockpiles. He burned more than 100 warships belonging to the provinces of Bizen and Bingo, which is to say he destroyed the navy that existed to stop him. And then, in 941, he sailed on Dazefu and burned it. Dazefu was not a village. It was the administrative capital of the whole island of Kyushu, the government seat of power in western Japan, and its point of contact with China and Korea. A former imperial official put the western headquarters of his own government to the torch. The timing could not have been worse for the court, and Sumitomo surely knew it. At that very moment, the government was fighting another rebellion at the opposite end of the country, where a warrior named Tara no Masakado had risen in the east and gone so far as to style himself a new emperor. The court was being torn at both ends at once, and Japanese history remembers the two revolts together as the disturbance of the Tengyo era. This is the moment when the imperial state discovered that it could no longer control the provinces with paperwork. That same year, the court sent a full imperial fleet under the overall command of Ono no Yashifuru, and the reckoning came in Hakata Bay. Sumitomo's fleet was smashed. Chronicles record more than 800 vessels captured. He was run down in Iyo that June and killed, and by one chronicle his head was sent to the capital, which was the state's way of insisting, in public, that it still existed. And here is what should genuinely disturb you about it, more than the fires or the ships. Sumitomo was not an outsider who broke in. He was a functionary the system produced, trained and armed, and then disappointed. The empire built its most dangerous enemy out of its own promotion ledger, and the only thing that turned a loyal officer into the pirate king of the inland sea was a job he was promised and did not receive. Sumitomo held that sea for 5 years, 2 of them in open war against an empire. The next man held a mountain for 40 years against the most powerful state in Western Europe, and when they finally destroyed him, they found that killing him once was not enough. Number 2. The 40-year rebel. In the mountains behind Malaga, in the south of what is now Spain, there is a shelf of rock riddled with chambers, staircases, and a church carved directly into the stone. Nothing about it looks like a capital city. It looks like what it was, a nest, chosen by a man who intended never to be reached. From that rock, a former bandit fought the richest and best organized state in Western Europe for 40 years, and never lost it. His name was Umar ibn Hafsun, and he did not start with an ideology or an army. He started with a killing and a run for the border. He came from a family of local landowners of mixed background in the mountains of the Malaga region, the sort of provincial gentry that the Emirate of Cordoba governed lightly and taxed heavily. In his youth, he got into serious trouble, and he fled across the sea to North Africa and worked, by tradition, as a tailor's apprentice in exile. Then he came back, and instead of returning to respectable life, he joined the outlaws in the hills. Within a few years, he was not just riding with bandits. He was commanding them, and he had taken possession of a ruined stronghold on a defensible plateau called Bobastro, and turned it into a fortress. That is the whole beginning. A criminal on the run occupies an abandoned rock. What happened next is what makes him extraordinary, because he understood something the Emirate did not, which was why the countryside hated it. Al-Andalus in the late 800s looked magnificent from Cordoba, one of the largest and most sophisticated cities on earth, with libraries, running water, and a court of astonishing wealth. It looked very different from the mountains. Out there lived Christians who paid extra taxes for the privilege of their faith, and converts to Islam who had been promised equality and were still treated as second class, and Arab and Berber clans that despised each other, all of them squeezed by tax collectors from a capital they never saw. Umar ibn Hafsun did not have to invent a grievance. He simply offered protection from the government to everyone the government was grinding down, and by the middle of the 880s, the Emirate was no longer facing a bandit. It was facing a rebellion spanning entire provinces. At his peak, he controlled a web of fortified positions across Malaga, Granada, Cadiz, Jaén, and Seville. That is not a hideout network. That is a functioning state inside another state, collecting its own revenue, holding its own territory, with its own capital on that rock in the mountains. 3 emirs of Cordoba in succession sent armies to destroy him. 3 of them failed. The man who finally organized a real answer was Abd al-Rahman III, one of the most formidable rulers of medieval Europe, who would later declare himself caliph and preside over the golden age of Cordoba. From the year 912, he ran what amounted to an annual industrial campaign, marching out every spring to take back the countryside piece by piece, refusing to gamble on a single decisive battle. It worked slowly. In 913 and 914, alone, his forces retook something like 70 strongholds. Bobastro itself never fell, while Umar ibn Hafsun was alive. The reason the rebellion eventually collapsed had nothing to do with siege engines, and it is one of the great self-inflicted wounds in medieval history. In 899, Umar ibn Hafsun publicly converted to Christianity and was baptized under the name Samuel. Strategically, the logic is visible. He was reaching for the Christian kingdoms of the north, above all Asturias, hoping to turn a provincial revolt into a front in a larger war with allies and outside supply. It destroyed him. Most of his Muslim followers, and there were a great many of them, had joined a rebellion against an unjust government, not a religious war against their own faith. Overnight, the man they followed had redefined what they were fighting for, and they left. He spent the last years of his life ruling a shrinking realm, still unbeaten in the field, hollowed out from the inside by a decision he made himself. He died in his own fortress, in his own bed, in 917 or 918, depending on which chronicle you follow. His sons held the rock for another decade. Bobastro finally fell in 928, and then the caliph did something that tells you exactly how deep the fear went. According to the chronicles, when Cordoba took Bobastro at last, Abd al-Rahman III ordered the bodies of Umar ibn Hafsun and his sons dug out of their graves. The corpses were carried down out of the mountains, across the countryside they had ruled, all the way to the capital, and there, at the gate of the palace in Cordoba, in the middle of the most civilized city in Europe, they were crucified in public. Think about what that act is for, because it is not for the dead man. It costs money and effort to transport corpses across a province. The only possible audience is the living. For 40 years, the government had told the people of the South that this rebellion was a criminal band that would soon be swept away. And for 40 years, the people of the South had watched armies march out and come back with nothing. The state needed to prove, physically, in daylight, that the man was mortal after all. It had to kill him twice, because the first time nobody had been allowed to see it. Every man in this list so far was hunted, and most of them were caught in the end, or bought, or pardoned, or displayed on a wall. Every one of those stories is still, fundamentally, a story about a state that wins eventually. The last one is not. In the last one, the king did exactly what the title of this video promises. He sent a real army with a prince of the blood at the head of it to wipe a band of robbers off the map. The army did not come back. Number 1. The bandits who beat an army. To understand how France ended up here, you have to understand what peace did to it. In 1360, England and France signed the Treaty of Brignais and stopped fighting. For the two kingdoms it was a relief. For the tens of thousands of professional soldiers who had spent a generation being paid to burn France, it was unemployment. These were not conscripted peasants who could go home to a plow. They were specialists. English, Gascon, Breton, German, Spanish, men who had done nothing else since adolescence, who owned armor and horses and knew exactly how to take a walled town, and who were now standing in a foreign country with no wages and no orders. They did not disband, they organized. The companies that formed out of that peace took a name that is bleakly funny, the Tarred Venus, which means the latecomers, the ones who arrived too late. Too late for the war, too late for the loot, too late for the pay. They were not a mob. They had captains, discipline, siege equipment, negotiated contracts, and a working business model, which was to occupy a defensible place, systematically strip the surrounding country, and then sell the region its own safety. They were good enough at it that, within months of that peace, they extracted a ransom out of the Pope. Innocent VI, in Avignon, with the resources of the Western Church behind him, faced these companies and paid them to go away. If the papacy could be taxed by unemployed soldiers, nobody in France was safe, and everybody understood it. In March of 1362, a force of them took the village of Brignais, just south of Lyon. Lyon was one of the great commercial cities of the kingdom, and Brignais put them close enough to bleed it. This was no longer a rural nuisance somewhere in the hills. It was a knife held against one of the richest cities in France. King John II, called John the Good, did the only thing a king could do without admitting that his kingdom no longer functioned. He raised a royal army and sent it to destroy them, and he did not put a local officer in charge. He gave the command to Jacques I of Bourbon, Count of La Marche, a former constable of France, riding now as the king's own lieutenant. The man needs to be understood because everything about this story turns on him. He had held the highest military office in the kingdom, Constable of France, commander of the royal armies. He was a prince of the blood, a man of the house of Bourbon. This was the crown of France reaching for its heaviest instrument and swinging it at a gang of thieves. Nobles rode out with him. Sons rode out with their fathers. The army that assembled outside Brignais on the 6th of April, 1362, was not a police action. It was the establishment of France in armor, arriving to make an example. The bandits had already thought about it more carefully than the establishment had. Their captains, Seguin de Badefall and a man known as the Little Meskin, split their force. One part they left visible on the low ground in the open, in plain sight of the approaching royal army. It looked like the whole of the enemy, standing where it could be ridden down. The rest they took up onto the high ground above and hid there. The royal army did what it had been trained by 3 generations of chivalric culture to do. It saw a smaller, inferior force in front of it, and it charged. Then the hills came down on their flank. The hidden companies hit them from above, on ground where cavalry could not turn, into an army already committed forward, and what had been a battle became a slaughter of exactly the men who mattered most. Chronicles give casualty figures no historian will defend, but the names of the dead are not in dispute, and they are what matter. Jacques of Bourbon, the king's lieutenant and a former constable of France, was mortally wounded and carried away to die of it at Lyon days later. His eldest son, Peter, was mortally wounded in the same fight and outlived him by a day. Louis of Alban, Count of Fours, was killed as well. In one afternoon, in a field outside a village near Lyon, a band of unemployed mercenaries destroyed a royal army and killed the commander of the armies of France and his own heir on the same ground. That is the promise of the title of this video, taken to its absolute limit. The king sent an entire army against bandits. The bandits killed the army. And then comes the part that everything on this list has been building toward, because France did not go back and finish the job. It could not. The tarred Venus were still there afterward, richer, more famous and easier to recruit for, and the crown had just demonstrated in public that it could not beat them. So a few years later, the French monarchy solved its bandit problem the way every government in this story eventually solved it. It hired them. The great companies were gathered up under a royal commander and marched over the mountains into Spain to fight a war in somebody else's kingdom. The problem was not defeated. It was exported with wages under a banner. 10 stories, look at how they end. The Cottrells robbed a church, taxed a mayor, kidnapped a royal judge, and finished the story pardoned and holding office under the crown. Eppelein was declared legally dead and went on robbing for 12 years, and the city that broke him on the wheel now shows tourists his hoofprints. Roger Godberd cost the crown a castle siege, 3 prisons and 5 years, and walked out of it pardoned. Ghino di Tacco robbed the pilgrim road to Rome, and in the story Italy kept telling, ended as an officer of the church. Fulk FitzWarin was hunted by 100 knights and was handed the castle he had wanted all along. Adam the leper burned a queen's property out of a merchant's house, and the court that tried him let him go because it was frightened. Kunz von Kauffungen touched 2 royal children and lost his head in 7 days. Fujiwara no Sumitomo was the government's own pirate hunter until the government cheated him. Umar ibn Hafsun beat 3 emirs and was crucified after death because dying once was not convincing enough. And the tarred Venus killed the king's own lieutenant, a former constable of France, and were then put on the royal payroll and pointed at Spain. Pardoned, mythologized, freed, promoted, rewarded, released, beheaded, hunted, crucified, hired. There is a pattern in there, and it is not the one the ballads sell. These men were not the opposite of medieval power. They were medieval power without the paperwork. They did the same things that lords and kings did, taking tolls from travelers, seizing property by force, holding hostages for money, burning the lands of anyone who would not pay, and the only meaningful difference was a document. A lord with a charter collecting money from the road was administering a toll. A man without one doing the identical thing was a bandit. And the fastest way to stop being the second thing was to be useful enough that somebody handed you the charter. That is why armies kept failing. You cannot defeat with soldiers a thing your own system keeps producing. Strip thousands of veterans of their land after a civil war, and you have built an outlaw band. Refuse a knight the pay he was promised, and you have built a kidnapper. Cheat a loyal officer out of a governorship, and you have built a pirate king. Tax a mountain province from a capital it never sees, and you have built a rebellion that lasts 40 years. Every one of these men was a bill the state ran up, and then declined to pay, and every one of them collected it on the road. Most people hear the word bandit and picture a man in the trees waiting for a purse. You just watch 10 of them take judges, cities, princes, provinces, and one entire royal army and force the most powerful governments of their age to negotiate. So pick one. Of these 10, which one truly beat the state that came for him? Say which, and defend it in the comments, because there is a real argument to be had about the last 3. And if you want more of the history that the ballads sanded smooth, subscribe. The road out of the Middle Ages is full of these people, and we are not done pulling them out of the archive.